Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. My name is Mark Perry. I'm from Ping Identity. I'm the APAC CTO based in Melbourne, Australia. And I'd like to take you around the world in 20 minutes, specifically talking about open banking. Now, this isn't a product pitch, so if you would like to talk product, grab me afterwards. I'll put you onto the right people, or please go to the Ping stand in the exhibition hall. But I'd like to also explain my impact on open banking. We at Ping have had a long history in the UK and in Europe in the open banking standards, and in Australia have been working on this with the different bodies for about 2 years. I'm on the advisory committee in Australia for the consumer data right, which is creating the standards for open banking and then also open energy, open telco and so on across the entire ecosystem in Australia. So what I'd really like to start with is to give you an understanding that this is a worldwide effort. And like most things that happen worldwide, it's a very broad planet. Everyone has a slightly different way of looking at things. And the open banking efforts are slightly different in different jurisdictions. And often they very closely match, if you like, the country's own persona. The stereotype of the country there. So, to give you a quick summary of open banking, the term open is the standards are open. The data itself is not open. Participants who request access to the data must be certified, and in most cases this is either done through different jurisdictions through government regulation. Other ones have a cooperation type model, and we'll go through that in each case. There are really two categories of use cases around open banking. The first is access to data. So the data that we have on our bank statements, basically, our transactions, when we get paid, when we use our credit cards, what our mortgage payments are, and so on. The second is actually initiating payments. So in the same way that we can use Apple Pay, the idea here is that open banking will provide an open standard for third parties to initiate payments back to the consumer's bank. There are generally three components to the open banking standards. There are firstly the APIs, which provide the payloads, the methods and so on, how to get to this data or how to initiate payments. The second part, which I work closely with, is the security APIs. So how are we actually securing the API access? How are we allowing the consumer to be sure that the underlying plumbing here is secure? It is their data after all. And secondly, the user experience, and that's based around the forward-facing things like authentication, the consent experience and so on. So you'll see all of the different open banking efforts around the world have different ways of looking at this. However, they have come to a general agreement in most cases that this is based around OAuth 2. And in most cases, OpenID Connect on top of that. Some of the more forward-thinking jurisdictions have actually settled on the FAPI standard, which is the financial grade API. And that's, again, built on top of OpenID Connect. So we're all open standards in most cases there. Now, it's interesting that where the standards efforts are not as well formed, not as well governed, divergence is the greatest across all the participants. And that's important because people who are building applications need to have certainty around this. They don't want to have to go to use different APIs from different players. It would be a development and maintenance nightmare. However, if you are a global application provider, then it is indeed quite difficult at the moment because all of the jurisdictions have slightly different versions of standards, both, of course, in the payloads for their banking regimes, but even in the security models. So, if you are a third-party developer wanting to do open banking across jurisdictions, it's going to be quite difficult. And, for example, if you are a multi-tenanted IDaaS, then providing this service for banks across multiple jurisdictions is going to be very difficult as well, and we'll delve into that. Very quick example architecture, because if you've got a diagram of any type, someone's going to take a picture of it and post it. So go for it. Really what we're looking at is an OpenID Connect framework here. So we have an OpenID Connect AS. We have some sort of consent service, and around that, the policy control to allow or deny access to data coming through the APIs based on what the user's consented to, but also regulatory data like geographic location or what have you. Also, there are APIs involved, so we need an API gateway, and that needs to invoke security based on OpenID Connect as well. That connects through to your back-end APIs. The other thing is there is some data storage requirement here, particularly when it comes to consent. So being able to store that in a way that doesn't create a new silo for the organisation, such that you can make use of that data around the rest of the organisation if you're a bank, is increasingly important. And most of the open banking jurisdictions require or strongly suggest strong customer authentication or multi-factor authentication. So that is a requirement as well, and that generally needs to be available in the mobile channel because, of course, SMS, one-time passcodes, are not secure. We shouldn't be using them anymore. So let's move on to the UK. They're really the trailblazers in this. They were the people who took the work that came out of Europe and said, we need to build a standard that people can actually implement. And now they're at version 3, and they are really the people who are providing the learning for the rest of us around the world. Firstly, they're very, very limited in the data that they allow access to. They only allow access to one type of account in that jurisdiction. But they also do payment initiation, which is interesting. They have a central body called the Open Banking Implementation Entity, which is run by the 9 major banks, the CMA 9. And they run not only the standards effort and the certifications and so on, but also the central directory, which provides that certification point for everyone who's involved in this effort. Now, in terms of standards, they are based on FAPI. They have a consent object within that standard, and again, they are pretty much I think the leaders in that space in terms of building out the APIs and in terms of the security model. One thing that's come to the UK model is the requirement for eIDAS, which is a certificate regulation coming out of Europe. That's coming into the UK standard in September, but I've just been told today actually there was an advice given to one of the participants in the UK. They could potentially use an eIDAS certificate and swap that with the OBIE certificate to allow access to APIs, which would make it easier for them to implement within a September timeframe. So the key learnings that those people have had, I think the main thing we've seen is a lot of press around low take-up of open banking. Now, open banking is not a product. You're not going to go into a branch and say, give me open banking. Okay, open banking is the plumbing here. It is the security model. It is the glue that makes everything work between participants that are trusted but ultimately separate. So it's very important that the user experience work well. In the initial UK model, there was no standard authentication flow. The banks were free to do whatever screens they wanted, and of course when the user is redirected from the app to the bank, there are all sorts of hoops to move through. And that produced a fairly poor user experience that hurt them initially. I think there's a lot of work going on in the UK around that. That should improve as they go forward. I think the other thing is a lot of the banks were very legacy based. They found it difficult to be compliant even with OpenID Connect. So again, they're on a journey to improve their infrastructure, and that is something that's improving as well. But on the back of that, it was difficult for FinTechs because there were many outages. The banks weren't particularly used to 24/7 type infrastructure with these sort of APIs. That work remains ongoing. Now, if we skip through to my country, Australia, we are very much broader than open banking. We actually call this a consumer data right, the right of the consumer to allow access to their data, eventually across all verticals within the economy. Banking is the first vertical, and that's a really good thing, I think, because of the requirement to be very secure. Energy is the next one off happening, and that effort has already started. That will probably be a slightly different model to banking in terms of how the participants access the data, but I hope at least at the security level that it is very, very similar. After that, there'll be telco, there'll be superannuation, which is like our 401k type environment, and additional verticals as we go. At first, we're starting with transaction data only. So we're looking at a very wide range of accounts on top of that though. So not only your savings accounts, but your credit cards and mortgages and so on. Payments will come in the future in Australia. The other thing is that because of the legislative environment, there are 3 different government bodies who need to work together to make this happen, which is a little different to, say, the UK model. That's led to some interesting hiccups along the way. We've had a very rough trot in terms of government stability, but now we think the legislation will actually be passed next month, so we'll be able to get going and go into production very soon. The standards are still in draft, so we need a bit of work to happen there so the vendors like ourselves can finalise our infrastructure for our customers. And the central directory itself is still being built out. So at least initially, there won't be dynamic client registration for participants. So there'll need to be a manual mechanism for digital certificates to be provided to each of those certified participants. So because of that, we've had production delayed until February next year for the big 4 banks in Australia. And in July 1st next year, the rest of the banks will need to come on board as well. If you've ever worked in a banking environment, that's still a really quick time frame. So they are struggling to make things happen, but people are doing a great job in terms of delivering the infrastructure and building out their APIs. So, New Zealand, the country of my wife. New Zealand's come at this from a different approach. They've actually built this around an industry-led effort. The government has sort of said, well, why don't you guys cooperate and do this as a bit of a pilot? So the 2 largest banks and 2 of the FinTechs decided to take this on, and they decided to work around payments only first. Now the reason for that is the government wanted to move to, as much as possible, to a 0 credit card transaction fee in the country, which is a really interesting way of looking at it. Their effort is based on OAuth 2. They are moving around FAPI, especially now they're starting to move towards data access. But they are now in production and things are working very well. Europe has been really the initiator of this effort with their PSD2 regime. Initially, PSD2 was a regulatory environment, I guess you'd say, and underneath that you had the RTS, the regulatory technical specifications that came in under that. The issue there was it really wasn't something that could be implemented with much consistency across banks. So several of the implementations are quite, well, not quite different, but different enough to make interoperability complex. So within that regulatory framework, other groups have sprung up in different countries or industry-wide to build out different, frameworks that could be implemented. One of them is the so-called Berlin Group. Others have sprung up in France, which is called STEP. There's one in Poland, and so on. So what I've done here really is look at the Berlin Group, which I think 60 to 70% of the banks in Europe have decided to follow. And really they call what they do a flexible framework. So in fact, they have 4 different methods of authenticating the user that banks can choose. Not only the traditional OAuth redirect method, but they also have what they call an embedded flow, which is essentially screen scraping. Allows the third party to embed themselves and capture the user credentials, and at least they're able to then digitally sign that message for security, but in effect they call it screen scraping plus, which as security professionals I hope we're all pretty unhappy with that as a method, and we hope that the banks do choose the standard OAuth flows where they're available. eIDAS is mandated in this regime, and that's something that the banks are working on at the moment. So let's move to Asia. Singapore, part of my territory. In Singapore, it's very much around, the government suggested this would be a good thing to happen. There are no mandated timelines for the banks, so adoption is voluntary, and they have released what they call an API playbook as a reference guide. So things are moving along there. What the government has done is limit it to the established traditional banks. So your neobanks, your challenger banks and so on are unable to play in this at the moment. And again, they're using OAuth 2, which is a really good thing, I think, for the industry. Very much, of course, the Singaporean flavour is that they believe that innovation will drive adoption. So there's hopefully going to be a big take-up of that. One of the things that Singapore does have is a single identity for their citizens, which could help in certain cases for this. To Japan, where, like the country itself, a lot of things are very consensus-driven. And in this case, the regulator has basically said, we think you should be doing this. And when the regulator says that, it actually means that you should do this, but we're not going to put in those words. The industry is followed, and really there's a consensus model between the participants. So the problem is that everyone's delivering this a little bit differently. They've each layered on an open banking API of their own. They have different OAuth scopes. There's no standardization around this. Even the security models are different in many cases. So just some use OAuth 2, some use OpenID Connect. There's a real mixture of things. So if you are a third-party vendor building an application, you've got a hell of a job to take that on. There are a low number of APIs at this time, but my contact in Japan tells me that there is a reasonable take-up of that. Hong Kong, so they are really just starting on their journey. They've started with publicly available product data, so interest rates, fees, and so on. In the next 12 to 18 months, so they will be looking at transaction data, and after that, payment initiation. At the moment, the documentation we have is that it is based on OAuth 2, but there's very little detail beyond that. And as we've seen from FAPI and the UK piece, it's really the detail which is very important for people who are implementing both on the bank side as well as on the third-party provider side. So we believe that this is likely to be very similar to Singapore at this stage. However, unlike other jurisdictions, it is government mandated. And let's flick to the USA finally. So at the moment, it's very much again, an industry-based approach. The government is staying out of different mandates. So some of the work has been done by third parties. For example, Mint uses OAuth tokens to connect to a couple of the banks. And I guess you could call that basically a pilot of this. Something the industry's done, got working, and shows people what's possible. However, there is an industry body called the Financial Data Exchange. It was launched late last year, and it's a non-profit organisation that's introduced an API around that using OAuth 2, being able to secure access. The thing is, there's no certification program as yet, but I'm sure that will change at some time soon. Interestingly, they're working with the FAPI working group, which is great for our industry that these things are coming together. So hopefully this type of effort around FAPI is something that will spread across jurisdictions, and we will start to see something a little more standard around the world that everyone can work from. Now the thing is that this is happening in a whole lot of other jurisdictions as well. I've just had the time to go through the major ones in the world that are getting towards production or in production. So there are many, many other countries looking at this. Just the last week, Canada has decided to move forward with open banking, and that will be a process now over the next 12 months to 24 months. We look at Mexico, Brazil, Malaysia. It's all happening. So if you're a security professional, especially in identity security, you need to be across this. This is really important for our industry. This is really important for the people consumers worldwide who wish to use applications that use their data. And as I mentioned, this will be beyond banking in the next few years. So what we're doing at the moment is building the plumbing, the framework, the regulations around open business worldwide. Whether or not we get true interoperability across jurisdictions, I don't know. As we've seen in other efforts previously, that's very difficult to achieve. But I think the important thing for us is it's here to stay. It is already in production in a couple of countries. It is something that's being used by consumers. And as we get away from the initial, what is it, what can I do with it, and it just becomes part of the fabric of our lives, it's important that identity security people are driving this in the various standards efforts and in the organisations that are building the apps and the services around it. Security is key. Don't let other IT professionals discount it. So I say that with the greatest respect to our brothers in the API industry, where they like to think, well, if I have an OAuth token, then that's security. Okay, it's a little more difficult than that. It's important that we build on the open standards that are proven and tested. And we look at the Australian model, where I'm on the advisory committee, and a lot of our commentary has been stick to the standards. Don't move away from what has already been built and tested, because at least we know that has been reviewed. There's a lot at stake for the industry, especially consumers. It's really important that we move this forward, but in a way that retains the user's consent, such that they understand what rights they're giving to third parties with this data. Otherwise, end users will drop off, and this won't see the take-up that it deserves. So, thank you very much. I'd like to take any questions you might have. Yes, in the front here, in the red. Do we have a mic?
That's okay. I think we can repeat that. So, speaking of OAuth or OpenID Connect, security point of view, how are you addressing some of the issues that are there? For example, the token is compromised or token replay. How are you addressing that in this open banking?
Yeah, well, firstly, there are actually...
Can you repeat the question, please?
Of course. Sorry. So the question was, how are we managing security in the open banking world in terms of OAuth token replay and hijacking and so on? So the first thing is there are recommendations in the specifications around how to manage those threats. So things like the window of expiry of tokens and so on can be used to manage some of those risks. Otherwise, there are standard models that we use within the infrastructure to help with that. So obviously, multi-factor authentication is a good way of helping to prevent just the reuse of a token, and the use of other models within products like pings can help with that. In the blue?
I was wondering if you had any insight into the insurance industry, uptake, adoption, any progress in that area?
So the insurance industry, what's the uptake with this type of model? And it's something that my customers in Australia in the insurance industry are looking at very closely because of that linkage to financial services. So they won't be required to join within that July 1 timeframe next year, but they certainly want to. I think the major thing about open banking is it's not just the consumer being able to allow access to their data, it's companies like insurance and other banks getting access to data about what their consumers are doing, so they can provide additional offers and so on. And this is something that insurance companies and superannuation and so on are very interested in. Yes?
Two things. What's the impact of the blockchain on this? And why are we talking about when you're talking the specification? Generally, when you talk the specification, you don't talk to the technology. Right? You talk to the technology, the specification.
Okay, so
Why are we mentioning the OAuth specification?
So two questions there. One is, what is blockchain, the impact of blockchain? For those of you with your bingo card, you'd be well on your way. So Virtually nothing. There's no need for a blockchain in this instance. There may be models where, I don't know if you saw the Microsoft demo yesterday, that distributed identifiers may be useful, but what we're talking about here doesn't require blockchain. Now the second part of the question was a little more fuzzy for me. You said, why am I talking about OAuth 2? Because that is the delegated administration specification for identity security that we use in an API infrastructure. So it absolutely has a part to play here. Yes?
Knowing that regulation might be a little bit murky here in the States, what are steps, if we could do 3 things walking away from this, what are things that you recommend those of us in IAM here in the States should do to better prepare ourselves for a rather ambiguous future?
Yeah, really good question. So what are the 3 things that people can do here in the States to prepare for a rather ambiguous future in this piece? I think you have to have the infrastructure and the processes ready to use OAuth 2 and OpenID Connect, because that's the baseline for security. I think the second thing would be to understand API security and the threats, as was mentioned, and be ready for the big change that might be necessary in application user experience. Because what you're dealing with here is something that's very consumer focused. It has to work very easily for the consumer. And as I mentioned before, as we've seen, if you don't have the user experience right, then the people who do get it right will eat your lunch. They will take market share from you.
Thanks.
Standards body that is involved in this? Is there any standards body, and does the PCI, how does the PCI come into the picture?
So the question was, what standards bodies are involved in this? So the FAPI working group, part of the OpenID Foundation, and they are really the standards body who are working towards producing or have produced a workable standard around the security of this. But otherwise, each of the jurisdictions has their own standards that they're working towards for the API payloads and how open banking should work in their own country. And you mentioned PCI? Yes. Look, nothing particular that is extra to what a bank normally needs to do. On the third party side, there are various discussions happening around how the third party should store data, how they should revoke the data they have access to, or archive or delete, and so on. Again, that tends to be very jurisdiction based.
And does open banking does get into payload encryption specifications?
Does open banking get into payload encryption specifications? Yes, so there are within the standards information around that type of thing, yeah. Yes, over here.
This may have been mentioned, but is there a privacy component to this? Or is that by jurisdiction, GDPR,
Yeah.
Is that something that would be incorporated into the standard?
So is there a privacy component to this? Absolutely. Again, it is very jurisdiction based. So if you look at, say, GDPR, particularly in this case in Europe, it is absolutely got a part to play. In Australia, we have our own privacy commission, which has input into the rules for open banking in Australia, and it'll be similar in other jurisdictions around the world. Yeah. Yes, up the back.
What about provisioning? Is there any standard? How you can basically establish trust between different
So the question is, how do we provision the participants, and are there any standards? Yes, so in many of the models, they're using a standard called dynamic client registration, which enables for the OAuth clients to be configured out of an event happening in a central directory. And as part of that, the key material is sent to the particular participants so they can communicate securely. Where jurisdictions haven't used dynamic client registration, they've had to do a manual process. So in Australia, we're looking at perhaps providing an API out of the central directory that the banks will have to poll regularly, which is not a great model if you think about it from a security aspect, because it creates a window where people might be revoked, but their certificates are still valid. Anyone else? I think I'm out of time. Maybe one more. Transportation industry? Yeah. Yeah, transportation industry is very interesting because I think they're one of the first ones that got data sharing in place. You look at, when you order a package, you can track it, probably across different companies as well. So I haven't seen any standardization effort around that happening, so I can't comment on that. Yeah. Great, thank you very much. Really pleased to be able to present to you today.